I was paying $2,400 a month for an apartment in the United States. Today, I rent a house in the Philippines for about $350. And the strange thing is, the $350 house is the first place in years where I've stopped worrying about money every single day. I'm 67 years old. I'm retired. And when I first started thinking seriously about moving overseas, I wasn't broke. That's important to understand. I had some savings. I had retirement income coming in every month. I wasn't sitting there with $20 in my bank account wondering where I was going to sleep. On paper, I should have been fine. My problem was that everything around me kept getting more expensive, and my income wasn't keeping up. The apartment was the biggest problem. It was a decent place, 1 bedroom, clean building, good area. Covered parking, central heat and air, nice kitchen. I could walk to a grocery store and a few restaurants. There was nothing wrong with it, except the rent. When I first moved there, I wasn't paying anywhere close to $2,400. Then the rent went up, and up again. Every time the lease renewal came around, I would open the email and wonder what the new number was going to be. By the time it reached $2,400, I knew something had to change. My monthly retirement income was a little over $2,200, so my apartment alone cost more than the money I had coming in every month. Everything else came out of savings: electric bill, internet, car insurance, gas, groceries, phone, health expenses, a meal out once in a while. Even something simple like getting the oil changed in my car seemed to cost more every time I did it. I had spent most of my adult life believing retirement would be the easy part. You work for decades, save what you can, and eventually you get to relax. But I wasn't relaxing. I was doing math. I'd sit at my kitchen table with my laptop open, looking at my checking account and figuring out how much I had spent that month. Then I'd figure out how much I had taken from savings. Then I'd calculate how many years I could keep doing it. That was the part that scared me, because I wasn't worried about next month. I was worried about being 77 or 82. What happens when you're old enough that working again really isn't an option, but your savings have slowly disappeared? I could have moved somewhere cheaper in the United States. I looked. I spent months looking. But whenever I found cheaper rent, there was usually a reason. Maybe it was far away from everything. Maybe I would need to move to another state. Maybe the apartment was much smaller. And even if I cut my rent by $500 or $600, I still had all the other expenses. I still needed the car. I still needed insurance. I still had groceries. I still had utilities. Saving $500 on rent wasn't going to completely fix the problem. That's when I started looking outside the United States. Not because I hated America. I didn't. And I wasn't looking for some adventure. At 67, I wasn't trying to backpack through Asia. I was looking for one thing: a place where the money I already had coming in would be enough. The Philippines kept coming up. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I watched videos where people talked about renting houses for $300 or $400 a month. I assumed there had to be a catch. Then I watched more and more. I started looking at actual rental listings. I checked grocery prices, electricity, internet, transportation, visa costs, health care. I probably spent 6 months researching before I admitted to myself that I was actually considering doing it. The plan was simple. I would come to the Philippines and try it. I wasn't selling everything. I wasn't telling myself I could never go home. I wanted to see what everyday life actually felt like. because watching somebody else live here on YouTube and waking up here every morning are two very different things. And within my first few weeks, I learned something else. Those $350 houses really do exist, but nobody tells you everything you're getting for $350, and everything you're not. The first house I looked at was about 30 minutes outside the busier part of the city. The owner wanted around 20,000 pesos a month. At the exchange rate at the time, that was more than I wanted to spend. The house was nice. 2 bedrooms, air conditioning, gated area, newer kitchen. I remember walking around thinking, this is still way cheaper than what I had back home. And it was. But I had set a number in my head before I came here. I wanted my housing cost to stay under $500 a month, preferably a lot under it. So I kept looking. A few days later, somebody showed me another house. This one was different. It wasn't in a subdivision. It was down a smaller road with houses packed closer together. There were kids playing outside, dogs wandering around, a little store about a minute away where you could buy bottled water, snacks, eggs, coffee, things like that. The house itself was simple. Concrete walls, 2 small bedrooms, tile floors, a basic kitchen, 1 bathroom, no bathtub, no hot water at the kitchen sink. There was an air conditioner in the bedroom, but the rest of the house depended on electric fans and open windows. The refrigerator was smaller than what I was used to. The kitchen counter looked like something I would have expected in a cheap rental 20 or 30 years ago, and the rent was around $350 a month. I stood in the living room doing the math in my head. My old apartment cost almost 7 times as much. 7 times. I told the owner I would take it. The first few days were exciting. I bought some basic furniture, a better fan, a rice cooker, even though I barely knew how to use one, some dishes, towels, a cheap table. I went to the grocery store and filled the refrigerator. For the first time in a long time, spending money on those things didn't bother me much, because the rent wasn't hanging over my head anymore. Back home, the first $2,400 I received every month was basically already gone. Here, my rent took only a small part of my income. That feeling was incredible. Then the rooster started. I don't mean one rooster, I mean several. I had always thought roosters crowed when the sun came up. That is not true, at least not the ones living near my house. One of them seemed to believe 3:30 in the morning was sunrise. Then another one would answer him. Then a dog would start barking. For the first week, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. I would lie in bed at 4 in the morning listening to animals having some kind of neighborhood meeting outside my window. Then there were the insects. I had bugs in the United States. Everybody does. But I had never lived somewhere where leaving one little piece of food on the counter could become an invitation. I learned quickly. Keep things sealed. White the counters. Don't leave dishes sitting overnight. Take the trash out. I also learned that the electricity didn't work exactly the way I was used to. One afternoon, the power went out. No warning. The fan stopped. The air conditioner stopped. The internet disappeared. I thought something was wrong with the house. I went outside and noticed everybody else was outside too. Brownout. People around me acted like it was nothing. I was standing there wondering how long I was supposed to sit in a hot house without electricity. It came back later. Another day, the water pressure was weak. Another time, the internet went down. None of these things were disasters, but they were reminders. You can't compare a $350 house in the Philippines to a $2,400 apartment in America and pretend they are the same thing. They aren't. My apartment back home was more comfortable. It was quieter. The power was dependable. The water pressure was good. The temperature inside stayed exactly where I wanted it. If something broke, I submitted a maintenance request. That was the life I was paying for. What I had to figure out was whether all of that comfort was worth the price, because something else was happening at the same time. At the end of my first full month in the Philippines, I checked my bank account, and for the first time since retiring, I had spent less money than I had received. That first month changed the way I looked at everything. My retirement income was a little over $2,200. Back in the United States, that money didn't even cover my apartment. Here, it covered my entire life. My rent was about $350. Electricity changed depending on how much I used the air conditioner, but it was manageable. Water was cheap. Internet was reasonable. Food depended on what I bought. If I tried to eat exactly like I did in America, especially imported food, I could spend a lot. But once I started buying more local products, chicken, rice, eggs, vegetables, fruit, and eating at smaller local restaurants, my food bill dropped. Transportation surprised me too. I didn't buy a car, at least not at first. I used taxis, ride-apps, jeepneys when I was comfortable with the route, and sometimes I just walked. I had spent years thinking a car was something every adult had to have. Back home, mine cost me money, even when it was sitting in the parking lot. Insurance, registration, maintenance, tires, gas. Here, I could go 3 or 4 days without spending anything on transportation. Most months, I was living on somewhere around $1,400 to $1,600. Some months were more. There were visa expenses, medical appointments, things for the house, a trip somewhere, a more expensive dinner. I wasn't trying to prove you could live in the Philippines for some ridiculously low number. I wanted to be comfortable. But even if I spent $1,600, that still left money from my monthly income. I wasn't pulling from savings anymore. That was the biggest difference. The amount sitting in my savings account stopped going down. For years, I had watched it slowly shrink. Now, it just sat there. Some months, it even grew a little. That gave me a kind of peace I hadn't expected. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking my bank account every few days. I could go out for lunch and not calculate what that meal was costing me over the course of a year. That probably sounds ridiculous to somebody who has never worried about retirement money. But when you're living on a fixed income, you start thinking differently. $100 isn't just $100. It's $1,200 a year. $500 a month is $6,000 a year. My old rent wasn't $2,400 in my mind anymore. It was almost $29,000 a year just for the apartment. Once you see numbers that way, they're hard to ignore. For about the first 6 months, I felt like I had beaten the system. I had this inexpensive house. I liked my neighborhood. People knew who I was. The lady at the little store would wave when I walked by. A neighbor started bringing me fruit sometimes because he had too much from his trees. I had a routine. Coffee in the morning, walk to get breakfast sometimes, grocery shopping once or twice a week, sit outside in the evening when it cooled down. My life was simple. Then something changed. It wasn't one big event. I just started noticing the things I didn't have. I visited another American I had met here. He lived in a newer subdivision. When I walked into his house, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No chickens next door, no motorcycles going past the window, no dogs barking 20 feet away. His place had 2 air conditioners, a nice kitchen, hot water, a bigger refrigerator, a proper shower enclosure, backup internet. There was security at the entrance to the neighborhood. I remember sitting in his living room thinking, this feels a lot more like what I'm used to. Then he told me what he paid, around $850 a month. My first reaction was that it sounded expensive. Then I caught myself. $850. I had been paying $2,400 back home. Suddenly, $850 sounded cheap. That started something in my head. I began looking at nicer houses online. $700, $800, $900. Some beautiful places were still less than half of what my old apartment had cost. I started telling myself I deserved something nicer. I could afford it. Why live in a $350 house when I didn't have to? And for about 2 weeks, I came very close to moving. Then one night, I opened my laptop and did the same thing I used to do back in America. I started doing the math. An $850 house instead of a $350 house was another $500 every month, $6,000 a year. Then I thought about a car, maybe another few $100s a month when everything was included. Then better furniture, more electricity, more eating out. It suddenly hit me. I was starting to rebuild the exact lifestyle I had moved halfway around the world to get away from. That realization bothered me more than I expected, because none of the things I was looking at were unreasonable. I wasn't shopping for a mansion. I wasn't looking at luxury cars. I wasn't planning expensive vacations. I was just trying to make my life a little more comfortable. And that's how it starts. $500 more for a nicer house. A few $100s for a car. A little more for electricity because now you're cooling a bigger place. You start buying more things because you have more room. You start eating at nicer restaurants because they're nearby. Each decision makes sense by itself. Then one day, you add everything together and wonder where the money went. I knew because I had already lived that way. For most of my working life, every time I earned more money, my expenses seemed to grow with it. Bigger apartment, better car, more subscriptions, more stuff. I didn't think of myself as somebody who spent too much. Most people probably don't. It just happened slowly. Retirement was the first time I really noticed it because there were no raises coming anymore. My income was mostly fixed. So when something got more expensive, I felt it immediately. I decided not to take the $850 house. But that didn't mean I suddenly loved everything about my $350 place. The roosters were still there. The kitchen was still small. The bathroom was still basic. And there were mornings when I would walk into the living room already sweating and think, there has to be something between this and spending almost $1,000 a month. So I started looking again. This time, I wasn't looking for the cheapest house I could find. I wasn't looking for the nicest house I could afford either. I was looking for something in the middle. That turned out to be harder than I expected. A few houses looked great online, but were completely different when I saw them in person. One was next to a road that had trucks going past all day. Another had a beautiful living room, but almost no water pressure upstairs. One place was cheap because it was so far outside town that I would have spent more money and time getting anywhere. Then I found a house for a little over $500 a month. It wasn't fancy, but compared to my first place, it felt like an upgrade. It was in a quieter area. The bedroom had a newer air conditioner. The kitchen had more counter space. The bathroom had a proper hot shower. There was room outside where I could sit in the evening. The internet options were better, and the neighborhood was still local enough that I didn't feel like I was living inside some expensive bubble. I went home that night and did the numbers. The difference between the two houses was about $150 to $200 a month, depending on the exchange rate. That was something I could handle without changing the rest of my life. I wouldn't need to touch my savings. I wouldn't need to cut back somewhere else. And most importantly, I didn't feel like I was trying to recreate the apartment I had left behind. So I moved. It was probably one of the better decisions I made. Not because the new house was amazing. It wasn't. There were still dogs. There were still occasional brownouts. I still had to deal with things I never thought about back home. But I was more comfortable. And my total monthly expenses were still low enough that I could live on my retirement income. That became my new rule. I stopped asking, can I afford this? Instead, I started asking, if I do this every month, what does it change? That question saved me from making a lot of decisions I probably would have regretted. One of those decisions was buying a car. I came very close. After several months without one, I started getting tired of relying on other people for transportation. When it rained, getting around could be annoying. If I bought a lot of groceries, carrying everything was a pain. There were places I wanted to visit that were harder to reach without my own vehicle. So I started looking. At first, I told myself I would buy something cheap. Then I started thinking, maybe I should get something newer, more reliable, better air conditioning, something with a little more room. Before long, I was looking at vehicles that cost much more than I had originally planned. That's when I stopped myself again. I asked the same question. If I buy this, what changes every month? Fuel, insurance, registration, maintenance, repairs, parking, maybe a loan payment if I didn't want to take a big chunk out of savings. Suddenly, the car wasn't just a car. It was another monthly bill. I ended up waiting. Later, I bought a used scooter instead. It wasn't perfect for everything, but for most of my normal trips, it worked. For longer trips, bad weather, or times when I needed to carry more, I could still take a taxi or book a ride. That probably wouldn't work for everybody, but it worked for me. And I think that's something I misunderstood before moving here. I thought living cheaper meant constantly giving things up. It doesn't have to. For me, it became more about deciding what I actually cared about. I cared about having air conditioning in the bedroom, so I paid for it. I cared about reliable internet, so I paid for a good connection. I liked having hot water in the shower, so when I moved, I made sure the next house had it. But I didn't care enough about owning a car to spend hundreds of dollars every month on one. I didn't need 3 bedrooms. I didn't need a swimming pool. I didn't need to live in the newest subdivision. Once I figured that out, the whole idea of retirement started to feel different. Back in America, I thought comfort meant having everything. Here, comfort became having the things that mattered to me without being scared of the bills. My monthly spending eventually settled somewhere around $1,600 to $1,700 most months. Some months were higher. There were always unexpected things: dentists, doctors, something breaks, visa costs, a trip, new tires for the scooter. You have to leave room for that. That's why I get nervous when I hear somebody say they can live in the Philippines for $800 or $1,000 a month and act like that number applies to everybody. Maybe someone can. I'm sure some people do. But I didn't move here to see how little money I could survive on. I moved here because I wanted my retirement to be sustainable. There's a difference. If you have $1,500 coming in and spend $1,500 every month, you're one bad surprise away from a problem. If you have $2,200 coming in and normally spend $1,600, you have some breathing room. That breathing room matters more to me now than a fancy kitchen ever did, because I remember what it felt like not to have it. I remember sitting in that $2,400 apartment wondering how many more years I could keep paying for it. Nothing was technically wrong yet. I still had savings, bills were paid, my credit was fine, but every month I knew I was moving in the wrong direction. That's a strange feeling when you're retired. When you're younger, you can tell yourself you'll make more money next year. You can work overtime, change jobs, get promoted. At 67, I didn't want my retirement plan to depend on somehow earning more money later. I wanted the money I already had to be enough. And for the first time, it was.
There was one part of moving that I didn't expect to think about so much: going home. For the first year, I still called America home without even thinking about it. If somebody asked where I was from, I'd tell them. If I talked about something in the United States, I'd say, back home. But the longer I stayed in the Philippines, the more complicated that word became. Because what exactly was I going home to? I didn't own a house there. I had given up the apartment. I had sold most of my furniture. I didn't have a car sitting somewhere waiting for me. If I decided tomorrow that I wanted to move back permanently, I couldn't just buy a plane ticket and pick up where I left off. I would need somewhere to live. First month's rent, deposit, furniture, a car, insurance, utilities, all the little things you don't think about until you have to start over. And rent certainly hadn't gotten cheaper. That was the first time I realized this move had changed more than my monthly budget. It changed what going back would look like. I could return to America. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't trapped in the Philippines. I still had savings. I still had family and friends in the United States. But returning permanently would be expensive. Very expensive. And I knew that if I went back to the same kind of lifestyle I had before, I would probably end up with the same problem. My retirement income wouldn't suddenly become larger because I changed countries. That bothered me for a while. There were days when I wondered whether moving overseas had been too big of a decision. Maybe I should have just found a cheaper state. Maybe I should have stayed closer to family. Maybe I should have waited another year. Those thoughts usually came when something here frustrated me. A brownout on a hot afternoon, traffic, trying to explain something when there was a language difference, missing a food I used to buy without thinking about it, missing birthdays, missing holidays. On those days, America looked pretty good in my memory. But memory has a way of leaving out the rent. It leaves out the insurance bill. It leaves out standing in the grocery store wondering why the same bag of food cost $20 more than it used to. It leaves out sitting alone at my kitchen table doing retirement calculations. Whenever I started romanticizing my old life, I tried to remember the whole thing. There were things I missed. There still are. But there were also reasons I left. Money was one of them. It wasn't the only one anymore. Somewhere along the way, I started liking the slower parts of my life here. I liked knowing the people around me. I liked walking to the little stores. I liked that I didn't feel like I needed to spend money every time I left the house. I liked sitting outside at the end of the day when it cooled down. My life wasn't impressive. That might actually be what I liked about it. I had spent a lot of years thinking retirement was supposed to look a certain way. Nice house, nice car, travel, restaurants, all the things people imagine they'll finally have time to enjoy. But I started realizing I didn't need retirement to look impressive. I needed it to last. And I needed to enjoy waking up in the morning without immediately thinking about money. The biggest surprise is that I don't really think about the $350 house anymore. At the time, it felt like the whole reason I came here. That number was what got my attention. $2,400 in America, $350 in the Philippines. It sounded almost too good to be true. And in some ways, it was.
because the cheaper house came with things I wasn't used to: noise, heat, brownouts, a simpler kitchen, a smaller bathroom, different standards, things breaking in ways I didn't understand. There were plenty of moments when I wondered if I had gone too far in the other direction. But that first house taught me something I probably needed to learn. I had spent years paying for things I thought I needed because everybody around me had them too. A certain kind of apartment, a car, a certain level of comfort. And I never really stopped to ask how much of it actually made my life better. When I moved into the cheaper house, all of that got stripped away pretty quickly. Then I had to decide what I actually missed, not what I thought I was supposed to miss, what I really missed. I missed having good air conditioning while I slept, so I made sure I had that. I missed hot showers, so I made sure I had that too. I wanted dependable internet because I use it every day. That mattered. But I didn't miss paying for a car. I didn't miss a big apartment. I didn't miss having a kitchen full of things I barely used. I definitely didn't miss spending nearly $30,000 a year just to have a place to sleep. That's why I don't tell people they should move to the Philippines because rent is cheap. That's too simple. Cheap rent can get your attention. It got mine. But you still have to live here. You still have to wake up every morning and deal with the heat, the traffic, the culture, the distance from family, and all the little differences that don't show up on a spreadsheet. If those things make you miserable, saving money won't fix it. I've met people here who complained about almost everything. The food wasn't right. The houses weren't built the way they wanted. The driving drove them crazy. They hated waiting. They hated the weather. They compared everything to the United States. And after a while, I wondered why they stayed. Saving $1,000 a month isn't worth much if you hate your life. That's one reason I think I got lucky. I didn't fall in love with the Philippines on the first day. I had to adjust. There were things I didn't understand. There were days I got frustrated. But little by little, I built a life that worked for me. Not a vacation, a normal life. That distinction matters. I don't wake up every morning and think, wow, I live in the Philippines. I make coffee. I check my phone. I figure out what I need to do that day. Sometimes I go somewhere. Sometimes I don't. Some days are interesting. Some days are boring. That's life. But underneath all of those normal days is something I didn't have before. I know I can afford tomorrow. And that feeling is hard to put a price on. A friend back in the States asked me not long ago if I thought moving here had made me rich. I laughed. No, definitely not. My income didn't suddenly become bigger. I'm still the same guy with the same retirement money. The Philippines didn't make me rich. It changed what my money could do. That's different. Back home, $2,200 a month felt small because one bill could eat all of it. Here, that same amount can cover my normal life and leave something behind. I think that's why I feel different, even though the number in my bank account isn't wildly different. I have room now. If my electric bill is higher one month, it doesn't scare me. If I need to go to the doctor, I don't immediately wonder what bill I'm going to delay. If I want to take a short trip somewhere, I can plan for it. And when something unexpected happens, I usually have enough left over to deal with it. That's what I wanted from retirement. Not luxury, room. I wanted enough space in my budget that every little problem didn't become a financial emergency. And I know somebody listening to this is probably thinking, well, you could have done that somewhere else. Maybe. There are cheaper places in America. There are cheaper countries than the Philippines. There are probably people living here for much less than I spend. That isn't really the point. The point is that I finally found a way of living where my income and my expenses made sense together. For me, that happened here. Would I recommend somebody my age sell everything tomorrow and move to the Philippines because they saw a cheap house online? No, absolutely not. I didn't do that either. I researched. I came here and tried it. I kept enough savings that I could leave if I needed to. And even after I decided to stay, I made mistakes. I chose the cheapest house first because I was so focused on saving money that I ignored some things that mattered to me. Then I almost went too far the other way and rented a much more expensive place simply because I could. It took time to find the middle. That's where I am now. I spend more than I did when I first arrived. My rent is higher than $350, but it is still nowhere close to the $2,400 I was paying before. And I'm more comfortable. That's been the biggest lesson for me. The goal wasn't to find the cheapest life possible. The goal was to find a life I could afford without constantly feeling like I was giving something up. There's a big difference between living cheaply and living within your means. I didn't understand that as well as I thought I did. Now I do. And every once in a while, usually when I'm sitting outside in the evening, I think about that apartment I used to have. It was nicer than this house, no question. Better kitchen, better bathroom, quieter, more comfortable. Everything worked the way I expected it to work. But I also remember what happened every month. The rent came out, then the other bills came out, and my savings went down again. I don't miss that part at all.
I used to think having a nice place meant I was doing well. Now I look at it differently. If you're sitting in a beautiful apartment worrying about how long you can keep paying for it, how comfortable are you really? That was the question I never asked myself. I was paying for comfort with stress, and I didn't realize how much stress until it was gone. Today my life is simpler. I have fewer things, I spend less money, I think more carefully before taking on another monthly expense, and I'm probably more aware of money than I was when I was working. But I'm not afraid of it anymore. That's the difference. My retirement income comes in. I pay my rent, I pay the electricity, I buy groceries, I pay for transportation, I enjoy myself, and most months there is still something left. It might not sound exciting, but after years of watching my savings disappear a little at a time, it feels pretty good. I'm 67. I don't know exactly what the next 10 or 15 years will look like. Nobody does. I could have health problems. Prices here could rise. Exchange rates could change. My priorities could change. Maybe one day I'll decide I want to go back to America. I haven't ruled anything out. But I know one thing. I'm no longer trying to maintain a lifestyle just because it's the lifestyle I had before. If something changes, I'll adjust. That's probably the biggest thing the move taught me. You don't have to keep living the same way just because you've been doing it for 30 years. Sometimes the numbers stop working. Sometimes what used to make sense doesn't anymore. And sometimes the answer isn't making more money. Sometimes it's changing the life the money has to support. That's what I did. I left a $2,400 apartment in America. I moved into a $350 house in the Philippines. Then I learned that neither one was exactly right for me. One cost too much. The other asked me to give up more comfort than I needed to. So I found something in between. A simpler house, a simpler routine, fewer monthly bills, and enough money left over that I don't spend every night wondering how long my retirement can last. If you had told me 5 years ago that this would be my life,
I probably wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought moving to the Philippines sounded too drastic, maybe even a little crazy. But sitting where I am today, it doesn't feel drastic anymore. It just feels normal. And when I think about what I gave up, I don't think first about the apartment. I think about the stress. That's the part I'm happiest to have left behind.